Fall is in full swing, and it's a perfect time to refresh your wardrobe with pieces that feel as good as they look. Luckily, Quince makes it easy to look polished, stay warm, and save big without compromising on quality. Quince has all the elevated essentials for fall. Think 100% Mongolian cashmere from $50, washable silk tops and skirts, and perfectly tailored denim, all at prices that feel too good to be true. By partnering directly with ethical, top-tier factories, Quince cuts out the middleman to deliver luxury quality pieces at half the price of similar brands. I've been loving a lot of the home goods, including their cotton fisherman throw, which is the perfect addition to warm up your house for the fall. So keep it classic and cozy this fall with long-lasting staples from Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's quince.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
Synergy is so important in groups and very unpredictable. We can't force synergy to happen. So synergy happening is much more like gardening than it is like following a recipe. But you can't force plants to grow well. There's a lot of conditions. There's weather, there's soil. So all you can do is try and create the best conditions you can for your garden to grow. The same is true with trying to get a group in a position for synergy.
That was Colin Fisher on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act for Burnout and Act Daily Journal.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and the author of an upcoming book on developing your confidence and social skills.
From Boston, I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, faculty at Brown University and author of Work, Parent, Thrive, and an upcoming book about misunderstanding.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hey listeners, this is Yael. A quick reminder to stay tuned until the end of the episode where you can hear my co-host post-chat with Jill Stoddard. Also, as a reminder, you can now listen to the podcast ad-free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. You can link to Patreon on the POTC website or go to patreon.com/offtheclockpsych. And if Patreon isn't for you, but you want to help us out, you can do so by sharing this episode with somebody that you think might benefit from hearing about the secret science of how groups work. Now here's the show. Since his days as a professional jazz trumpet player, Colin Fisher has been fascinated by group dynamics. As Associate Professor of Organizations and Innovation at University College London School of Management, Colin's research has uncovered the hidden processes of helping groups and teams in situations requiring creativity, improvisation, and complex decision-making. He has written about group dynamics for media outlets including BBC, Forbes, Harvard, Business Review, NPR, and The Times, and we are here to discuss his brand new book, The Collective Edge: Unlocking the Secret Power of Groups. Welcome, Colin.
Thanks so much for having me, Yael.
I'm so excited to have you here today, in part because I am interested in group dynamics from a slightly different angle, which is that I study couples and treat couples. And one of the sort of foundational questions I wanted to start with is, what is a group and why is it different than a one-on-one relationship? What do they have in common, but also what distinguishes what you call groups from a partnership or a friendship or a parent-child relationship?
Yeah. What is a group is a contested thing within groups research. So a lot of psychologists will label everything from a co-acting group to social categories, and they'll differentiate that from relationships or real teams. I talk in the book about a continuum that has a really terrible name in social psychology, which is group entitativity, which is really hard once you actually have to figure out how to say it out loud. But so I think it's better if we talk about it as groupiness. and to say that like different collections of people vary on their groupiness. And so a partnership or a relationship is less groupy than I would say a real team of 3, 4, 5, 6 people would be. So a relationship is less groupy than a real team of 3, 4, 5, 6 might be. And it's more groupy than probably a bunch of random people standing at a bus stop. So, rather than saying, is that a group, is that not a group? As you say, it has a lot of the characteristics that groups would have. And that I think a lot of the things in managing a relationship are very much the same as managing a team or a group of any kind. And there are a few things, though, that I think are different.
Yeah. How would you define what makes a group groupy?
Yeah. So I don't think a lot of the definitional characteristics of groupiness aren't going to be very good for differentiating it from a relationship. So the first thing is that we have clearly defined boundaries. So we know who's involved in the group. And the groupiest groups, what I would call real teams, have very clear boundaries. So you know exactly who's on the team. We might be wearing the same uniforms. We might just have, there's the 4 of us and we know it's the 4 of us. So there's very clear cognitively defined boundaries. The second thing is that we have recognizable patterns of interaction. So that if you watch us over and over, we can do things that you go, oh, I see that they understand each other. I see they know how to interact. Proximity is also another cue of groupiness, where if we see you in the same place, if we see you near each other a lot, then we're going to think you're more groupy. And then a common fate is the last characteristic of groupiness, where if something happens to one of us, the rest of us share that fate as well. And so all of those things, I would say, pretty much apply to couples as well. But we don't have as much, I would say, of the complexity that a lot of people who study groups really get into, where, there's tensions between satisfying goals in one relationship than satisfying goals in another relationship. And I'd say another difference from a lot of the kinds of work teams that I study in relationships is that the goals of the collective are often at odds with the goals of the individuals in work situations. So what would be best for my employer is that I would give 100% of myself to my job, to my work, to my team, and that I would be so dedicated, even at the expense of my individual goals, to the goals of my work group. And that it would be quite unusual, especially in non-work relationships and friendships or romantic relationships, for us to have that same character to them. That there's usually not that tension between the individual and the collective to the same extent. Obviously, there's going to be tensions between the goals of any 2 individuals, but there's not the sense that the collective could like eat your individuality in the same way that I think a lot of work teams have.
Well, so that actually is a nice segue to the next question. And throughout our conversation, we'll talk about sort of the good aspects of groups, and we'll talk about some of the darker sides of groups. But one of the things that you really start the book off with is this idea of group-based thinking. And you offer this wonderful metaphor. I love any metaphor that takes advantage of Harry Potter because I'm obsessed with Harry Potter. But you start off with this idea of the sorting hat and how we all have a sorting hat within. And the sorting hat is the real villain of the story. And I wonder if you can introduce us to a little bit of why that is, why our inner sorting hat shaping our daily lives can be a real villain.
It's a funny story. When I first read Harry Potter, so I read it, I was not a child when I first read Harry Potter. I'm a little too old for that. But when I first read it, I was convinced the sorting hat was going to turn out to be a villain. And I mean, I think this may speak to my suspicion of sorting other people into categories of, the sorting hat in Harry Potter. You put it on someone's head and it says, oh, you're this type of person. You belong with these people. You have these intrinsic characteristics. And therefore, we're going to sort you over into Gryffindor, and you're going to do everything with them. And everything the other Gryffindors do is good, and everything the Slytherins do is bad. And if you're in Slytherin, you're going to think the exact reverse of that. And I think there's two things that made me really suspicious of that, and I think should make us suspicious of anyone who has sort of similar sorting proclivities. One is that there's something in your head that says, oh, you're this type of person, you belong in this type of group. And I think that kind of intrinsic characteristic-based sorting, one, just has a really bad history in science, where that's not really an effective way of sorting people, to have them take any kind of personality tests, any kinds of things about their traits, and then say, oh, this is the kind of group you're going to get along with. That actually has a shockingly bad research history where it just doesn't help anything. That's not a helpful thing to do. So a lot of organizations use personality tests like the Myers-Briggs type inventory to help sort people into groups or to put them into leadership development programs. And there's just no science behind that. That first, the Myers-Briggs type inventory is pretty pseudoscientific. It's not a very valid way to measure people's traits and personality, and there's no such thing as personality types. But beyond that, that mentality of even if we had really scientifically valid personality measures, that's still not a great way to put people into groups. And that there was a meta-analysis I talk about in the book of using personality measures to assign people to groups. And their conclusion was there's no combination of personality characteristics that predict effective groups and effective teams across different kinds of tasks. So there's that suspicion of the sorting hat where it's looking at your traits and it's saying you should go in that group. And that's not a great thing to do. But the second is the system in Harry Potter of people being put into a house and you're stuck in that house for everything. You take all your classes with people in that house, all your sports teams, all your clubs, almost everything are in those. And they have these rivalries that are really encouraged in the school and in the institution and in the world. And then, spoilers for Harry Potter, but the divisions that the sorting hat makes are basically the divisions of the wars that take place in the book. And it's hard for me then to get behind this magical piece of clothing that's putting people into the groups that then end up going to war with one another, that seems like a pretty villainous thing to do. So I was always suspicious of that. Funny aside, now that I live here in London, houses are real. That they do sort kids into different houses. They're not quite as serious as in Harry Potter, but even in primary school, there were the different houses that they had, and they so it's not quite as fantastical as I had thought when I first read the book.
Well, yeah. And I mean, I think you make the point that we all have an inner sorting hat. So it manifests in academic halls in certain ways, but all you have to do is read the news and you can see how groupy we humans are, that we think about groups by religion, by culture, by political party. And, the dark side is that we get into verbal wars and sometimes actual really devastating wars, and we see that happening. And so I think your book is coming out at a really important time where we need to talk about the dark side of groups. But I do also want to say that what your book does is talk about the gift of groups and how wonderful it is, and how sometimes we actually overlook the positive power of groups. And you give this one example of how we tend to be very obsessed with individual genius. You think Steve Jobs, Einstein, Mozart, but you argue that we often miss something really huge about the genius of teams. So I wonder if you can say a little bit about how we remember the individual but forget the group and what we lose because of that bias.
The lone genius myth to me is one of the main reasons I wanted to write a book like this. So you and I are in a book group together, and we see so many of these nonfiction books, and it always shocks me how many of them are about individuals. But I think that's a reflection of our psychology, and that we experience the world as individuals. And so it's natural that when we read a book, when we get advice, when we think about change, we think about changing ourselves, because that's the most consonant with our experience. We wander around in our own heads, in our own bodies, having our own experiences. And so things that are aimed at the individual level, I think, resonate with people much more readily than things that are more collective or systemic. And then we have one of the most known findings in social psychology, which is the fundamental attribution error, which says when we see other people, make a mistake or do something great in a lot of cases, we tend to explain their failures and success with their individual characteristics. If somebody's late for a meeting, we think they're lazy or irresponsible. If somebody runs $1 billion business, we think they're a genius. And that we systematically overlook and underestimate the value of situations. And unfortunately, we mostly write off groups as situations rather than collections of other humans. And this is where I think we're really missing something. That there's a famous quote that we're pretty sure Margaret Mead said, we're not positive. Never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And that quote, I think, rings really true, and it resonates with the research that I've done and I've read as part of writing this book, that groups and teams are creating most of the new knowledge in the world, that most of the really important problems we have in society today are things that we need teams to solve, that there's no one person with the expertise, with the different perspectives that need to be taken into account, and that we almost always need a group to solve these problems. And even when we read in the news that some individual has solved these problems, even something like writing a book, winning the Nobel Prize, all these things, there's a hidden group behind them. Every invention, every book, every great company that I've really dove into the story behind them, there's always a group behind it. And those groups just don't get the same credit that individuals give because of this fundamental attribution error, because we want to tell our stories in terms of heroes and villains, and that it doesn't resonate with our psychology the same way when we say, actually, it's this great group. And so what I'm trying to do here is really make the idea of groups more accessible in a way that I think it has been difficult to do throughout trying to make this science, to make people more aware of this science.
So what you're saying, and as I was reading, I was thinking about a book that I'm currently obsessed with called The Undoing Project. It's a Michael Lewis book. It's terrific. And it's the story of Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky. And one of the themes throughout it is how one of the tensions in their relationship was that it was really hard for the world at large to see them as a partnership. In turn, one of them would get more credit than the other, and it really caused a strain in their relationship because so much of their genius work in those early years was really the result of this incredible synergy that they had. And we'll talk about synergy in a moment. But it was just so challenging because even though they knew internally from the inside of their partnership that they were equal contributors in different ways, but that the magic came because of their collaboration, that often it was interpreted that one of them was in the lead, whereas the other was more like the hanger-on. And it really did cause strain in their relationship. And in the book, Michael Lewis talks about this one researcher who did some inquiry. I think they ended up not ever publishing it. So the findings are really in Michael Lewis's book about these really fertile partnerships that it was really hard to even know who it came from because it was so much the power of their synergy where the brilliance emerged.
Yeah. Partnerships like Kahneman and Tversky are inherently synergistic, right? Like that's why we need them. there's just not one person out there who can stimulate themselves, who can do as much research, who can have as many different perspectives or different kinds of knowledge as a group can. That any kind of group is inherently going to have a lot more resources to bring to bear to any problem. But the evaluators, onlookers, like Nobel Prize committees, like journalists who want to tell the story of these people, they want a protagonist because that is what resonates for us. So that we need a main character and we need somebody to kind of be subordinate to them. And it's very, very hard to tell a story with multiple equal main characters, much less 3, 4, 5 co-equal main characters. And so we're just not used to digesting information in that way. And in the book, I talk about a different Nobel Prize-winning group that Watson and Crick are the kind of dyad that gets the most credit for this. But there's been more and more research into some of their other collaborators who had also worked on this same project. One of those was Rosalind Franklin, who of the sort of 4 main contributors was the only one not to win a Nobel Prize. A lot of times people say, oh, it's because she died before those Nobel Prizes were awarded, but there was actually no rule against deceased people winning Nobels at that time. So it's not clear that that's exactly why she didn't win. Obviously, she was also the only woman in that group of 4, and she didn't win. But a lot of the credit came afterwards. So James Watson wrote a book that really publicized their story. And in it, he really cast himself as a protagonist. And he really diminished Franklin's contributions to the discovery of the double helix structure of DNA. And so you can kind of see a lot of the dynamics that happen in teams. And again, we're talking a lot about the dark side of it here, but that people systematically overestimate their own contribution to any team. So there's a great study where they asked a bunch of teams to estimate their own individual contribution to the group. And obviously that should add up to 100% if everyone was being perfectly rational and aligned in their perceptions. It never added up to 100%. It's always over 100%. And in one study, the average of adding everyone up was 235%. So everyone thinks that they're contributing more to a group than they probably are. And that evaluators and onlookers and everyone who wants to understand the story are looking for that one person to extract. And so you can see how we would systematically underestimate how important groups and teams are in basically every walk of life.
Totally. And the thing that I find really interesting, just kind of coming back to this theme of like, are couples different than groups, is that the same thing happens in partnerships where routinely, if you ask a partnership how much they each contribute to the domestic labor, the number is always greater than 100%, that we overestimate our own contribution. And, you know, one thing that just occurs to me is that I think, you know, part of that is that like we can identify our own difficulty, but it's very hard to kind of assess what is the challenging or it's hard to sort of get inside of the skin of somebody else's contributions. And so that's why a part of why the fundamental attribution error is so fundamental, because we can't make contact with what somebody else is doing. Even if they tell us, we sort of don't have the visceral experience of it that we do. And the other piece of it is that I think the world is so complex. And so we can sort of dig into our own, but we get overwhelmed by thinking about the multiple sets of experiences that are happening around us. And so part of, I think, what is so challenging about thinking about group dynamics and sort of seeing the complexity is that it's just easier to lump a group together. But one of the things that I've also gotten very interested in that you talk about in your book is this idea of shared reality, that within a group, it is so hard to kind of hold different perspectives. And so part of what inherently happens is that we start to develop norms, and it creates this ease of sort of being able to communicate and collaborate. But it does limit us in how we're able to critically think about whether we're abiding by moral ideals or, behaving in ways that are ethical. And so I wonder if you can say a little bit about how shared reality forms in groups and how to know when it might be becoming dangerous.
It's so important to understand how shared reality and social norms form in groups because they control us so invisibly and that we become unaware of them so quickly. So a long time ago, a lot of us, I'm sure a lot of your listeners have heard of Tuckman's model of group development, which was storming, norming, performing, and then later adjourning. And I mean, the thing I think that I took away most from that model was that if you want people to remember something, you should make it rhyme. Because, that model actually is not very much how work teams behave. And when we've studied actual teams with deadlines, we don't see that they go through this predictable progression of phases. Instead, what we see is that people form social norms almost instantly with a group that they meet. So people come into a room, they sit in certain positions. Whoever talks the most in their first interaction is probably going to be the one that talks the most going forward. Whoever sits silently is probably going to sit silently. If you start out with small talk in the first meeting, you're probably going to continue to start out with small talks in subsequent meetings. Or if you get to work right away, that's probably what you're going to do. If everyone looks at their phones before the meeting and doesn't interact, that norm is going to likely stick. And so social norms start forming right away because in any kind of ambiguous situation, our prehistoric brain wants us to belong. It wants us to fit in. It wants us to feel accepted by the other members of the group. And that's what people usually call a sense of belonging. And that's because being ostracized by the group, even a group of strangers that you hadn't known very long, was a huge risk for prehistoric humans. That we needed other people to keep watch at night. We needed to divide labor and to get food. We needed people to look after young children and when we couldn't do it ourselves. And so the risk of being ostracized is so acute in our brains that we instantly are looking for what's normal here. I'm going to do that and I'm going to fit in. So norms are forming instantaneously. Anytime we're uncertain about things, anytime we don't have a strong opinion, we look around the room and we say, all right, I'm going to try and adopt what is going to be inoffensive. And that's usually what other people are doing. So norms are forming immediately. But those norms, once we behave in a certain way, that also gives us permission to behave that way and then a little bit more extreme than that same way. And so what we see in groups like cults, what we see in groups where, or organizations where a lot of ethical problems emerge and become normalized over time, is that there's just a slide towards what the initial preference of the group is. So if you have a group where people want to behave a little more risky, a little more edgy, a little more pushing the envelope, that over time we're going to keep sliding farther and farther away from wherever we started towards a more extreme position. And that things seem normal to us very fast. And again, the longer we're in these groups, the more we fear ostracism from those groups, the more we want to fit in, the more we want to belong. And so these social norms are constantly forming and what we would call crystallizing. They're getting stronger. They're becoming clearer to all the members what the norms are. And that in, the worst kinds of groups, you're punished for deviating from those norms quite quickly and quite severely. And that's how you end up with these groups that are not behaving so well. But as you said, for the most part, norms are good, right? Like if we had to figure out how to say hello to each other every single time we met a new person, it's like, we have to come up with a way to do this now. If we had to figure out, how to pay at a restaurant or how to tip or how to do all these everyday little social interactions, that would be really costly. So social norms are great for things that are repetitive, for stuff that help us coordinate, but they can also be manipulated by the unscrupulous for their own ends. And they can also end up in some really perverse kinds of outcomes that we don't want to see.
Yeah. And I mean, as I'm listening, I'm just thinking about current events that might reflect some of these things happening in real time, right? You can see polarization and groups getting more extreme over time rather than kind of coming to the middle. You can see the echo chamber effect where within groups, you can say almost anything and your in-group will justify it. And you can also see this coercion trap. These are all things that you talk about in your book where, polarized groups live and die through coercion. And so any whiff of disagreement or dissent is cause for punishment. And so people are much less likely to speak up. And so that creates increased risk for that continued drift into more extremism. And so, one of the things that I want to talk a little bit about is how do you start to recognize that you might be inside of one of those groups that might have coercive group dynamics, either as a leader or as a member, and what might be some things that you can consider trying to kind of, protect yourself and the people that you care about that might be inside of that group to stay in a position of being, moral, ethical, but like to prevent really terrible consequences.
So I think one of the ways you can always check the health of the climate of your group is by asking yourself about what Amy Edmondson calls psychological safety, which is how comfortable would you feel asking a question that maybe challenges a norm? How comfortable would you feel making a suggestion or admitting a mistake? If the answer is not very comfortable, you're certainly not alone. There's a lot of groups that are like that. But that is a warning sign already that groups where people aren't comfortable speaking up, they're not comfortable asking questions, they're not comfortable admitting mistakes, are groups that are at risk for a lot of dysfunctional kinds of conformity pressure, whether that's feeling pressured to make certain kinds of decisions or fear of speaking up, or whether that's more polarized groups or more cult-like groups. Those are all things that happen when we don't have a lot of psychological safety. But polarization does rely on the group having and defending pretty strong boundaries. And so one of the main prescriptions for any group, not just a group that thinks it's at risk of polarization, is making sure it's making healthy use of things from outside its boundaries. And there's two basic things that come from outside the boundaries. One are newcomers to the group. And so when you look at how a group treats its newcomers, does it look at those newcomers as a source of learning, where we can say, oh, here's somebody who's bringing an outside perspective, who can ask questions about us, who can maybe point out things that we've been doing that don't make sense. And they can ask, it's like, hey, why do you do things that way? And rather than trying to say, well, that's how we've always done them, you should do them too, to say, hey, why do we do things that way? What could we do differently? So newcomers are a really important source of kind of inoculation against polarization and conformity pressure. But the other side of that is what MIT professor Deborah Ancona calls boundary spanning. That means it's somebody's job in the group to do little sanity checks on how we're thinking within the group, and that there's kind of a network of advisors that we're connected to, who we are bringing stuff to as we're working. And that any really good group, especially at work, has these boundary spanners. So I did a lot of research in design teams, and they would actually structure this into the structure of a team. So they'd have the core project team that would be working on the design project, but they'd have what they called the extended team. And they would say, these are the people when you need help. These are people who are your first line of call to go to. And so there was never a project team that had a chance to get so insular that they could really, really polarize away from the rest of the organization. And the same is true for almost any other kind of team, whether it's top management teams, whether it's boards of directors, or whether it's families, right? Like if we're not going outside our little nuclear group of people and saying, hey, this is how we're doing it, what do you think? Then we're at risk of at least a mild form of polarization, if not more extreme ones.
Yeah, that's so wise. And I'm just thinking about that with couples too, that, it is good to sort of get a healthy reality check on, hey, this is how we're doing it. How do you do it in your relationship? It can sort of create a little bit more of a reduction of the echo chamber, right? So that you can recognize that there are realities that aren't just the one that you're existing within. And then you can make a more open-eyed decision about, is that the reality that I want to continue to feed into?
This summer, I've started asking myself a question. Could I maybe have ADHD? It's a question that has come up more frequently as we've had guests on our podcast who have discussed this topic. The jury is still out on it and probably will be for a while longer, but I am consuming a lot of resources on the topic, and one podcast that I have been binging is ADHD Aha. And that was a long time before they actually became a sponsor of this show. Every episode, ADHD Aha has a guest on who talks about the moment they realized that they have ADHD, how it showed up for them, and how they adjusted to it. In an episode with Jesse Anderson, for example, that I listened to this morning, he talks about the difference between importance-based task management and interest-based task management. And I thought, wait, that's me. So for someone like me who only has a surface understanding of what ADHD actually is about, this is incredibly interesting and useful. To listen to ADHD Aha, search for ADHD Aha in your podcast app. That's ADHD Aha with Aha spelled AHA. And an exclamation point at the end, because it's really that good.
If you're shopping while working, eating, or even listening to this podcast, then you know and love the thrill of a deal. But are you getting the deal and cash back? Rakuten shoppers do. They get the brands they love, savings, and cash back. And you can get it too. Start getting cash back at your favorite stores like Target, Sephora, and even Expedia. Stack sales on top of cash back and feel what it's like to know you're maximizing the savings. It's easy to use, and you get your cash back sent to you through PayPal or check. The idea is simple. Stores pay Rakuten for sending them shoppers, and Rakuten shares the money with you as cash back. Download the free Rakuten app or go to Rakuten.com to start saving today. It's the most rewarding way to shop. That's RAKUTEN, Rakuten.com.
I wanted to back up a little bit and have you talk a little bit more about psychological safety in terms of one of the common myths that people have, which is that when you're in, this is the myth, and you lay this out beautifully in your book, and I think it's so important. But when you're inside of a group and you're sort of trying to gauge whether, is it psychologically safe to speak up, one of the things that people might assume is that a psychologically safe group means that it's comfortable or easy to speak up. And I want you to sort of help bust that myth because I think it's an important one.
Yeah, when I teach about psychological safety, one of the most common misconceptions is that means this is a group that never has any conflict, that's really comfortable and easy to be a part of. And that psychological safety is not like a comfortable warm bath. It's not a relaxing state in most groups. It means we're constantly seeking to learn and we're challenging one another, and that when people have different opinions, they're speaking up. And that in a really psychologically safe group should be a lot of the time. That it's really unusual and a little bit unhealthy if we all think the same thing about the same issues over and over and over, that's either a sign that we're too homogenous and we don't have enough of the perspectives we need in this group, or a sign that we're not really psychologically safe and that we need to encourage people to speak up more. So it's definitely a myth that psychological safety is the same as harmony in some sense, that psychological safety often looks very conflictual. It looks like a very challenging, combative place to be. And that can be okay, as long as we are making it about the task and about doing things better. We're making it about learning. And that, these kind of challenging one another get dysfunctional when we start making it about the other person. And that then we're making attributions and all kinds of things I'm sure that you study get way worse than they would in a group where we're all trying to get better at something. We're all trying to find a better solution, a better way forward. And so we're speaking up in the service of doing that.
And I think that that's such like a good tip. A, that it doesn't feel like a warm bath. So set your expectations accordingly. But also that the skill of doing it is about disagreeing about the task or the idea while still kind of holding on to a common end or a common fate, I think is how you talk about it in the book. And to really be cautious about making it personal, right? Like a personal attack, but instead to sort of do this like shared project idea, even though you disagree, right? That the goal is still something that you have in common that you're trying to strive toward, even if you disagree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
those are
absolutely.
really good tips.
Yeah. So disagreement in groups, that we have different skills, different perspectives, different opinions. That's healthy. We need that to have effective groups. But when we share those different opinions, that often means, somebody's not getting exactly what they wanted as an individual. And it's easy for that disagreement about ideas to spill over into negative attributions about the other person. That they're not just disagreeing with me about this task. They don't want the best for me. They're out to get me, that they're a difficult person. And that once a group crosses over into thinking that way about one another, they're now in a very difficult position. And so a lot of what being an effective group member and an effective group leader is to keep us focused when we are disagreeing on our shared goals, on our mutual respect for one another and our ability to share disagreement, but at the same time, come to something that we can all get behind and move forward on. And that's really difficult. And it's not something that you do once, right? That I think this idea that, psychological safety or any other kind of trust is not an event. It's not something that you do at the beginning and then you forget about. It's a process that you're constantly enacting, that you're constantly maintaining. And that's what's so difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I like to think of it as a practice of how do you turn it. So again, in the couples therapy room, it's often a practice of how do you turn this conflict into a framework of us versus the problem, even if the problem is we disagree. So how do we approach this disagreement in a way that's in the service of our relationship with one another? And I think that isn't easy to do, especially when emotions get activated, when you feel hurt. And therefore, it does need to be a practice because, we have these minds where we immediately get self-protective, which causes us to get into the orientation of me versus you. And so we have to sort of really be able to reflect on, okay, how do I sort of come back in and transform this into the group, or me and you can join forces to tackle this together. And that's not easy, but so valuable.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to sort of turn to talking about the bright side of groups, because groups really are beautiful. And, you come at it, I think, with such a fascinating history as a jazz trumpet player. And I do have to say that I know like less than nothing about jazz, but inspired by your book, I read your book while listening to Kind of Blue, the jazz album by Miles Davis. And it was so fun to kind of get into the headspace of a jazz musician while reading. It was so thank you for turning me on to that album. It was lovely.
Yeah, amazing. My work here is done.
Yeah. I'm a little less ignorant about jazz music, but just a very small bit. But, one of the cool things about music is, and people playing together, is this experience of synergy. And I come at it from a different perspective, which is that I rode crew in college. But I know so viscerally that experience when all bodies are moving together and you feel the boat lift and a lightness come and you're just kind of flying through the water. And it is magical. Like that moment where people are collaborating and the whole is greater than the sum of its parts is something that we get through the group experience. And so I wonder if you can walk us through what synergy feels like from the inside and how it happens.
Well, I don't know if I can do any better than the way you just described it. But synergy is so important in groups. It's on some level the sort of highest form of teamwork, where we can't just add up everybody's individual skills, everybody's individual effort. We get something that's different from what anyone could have predicted. And really, that's what got me into studying groups in the first place, was these similar experiences of being part of improvising groups and us making music that, and the group bringing out of me something I never could have predicted or could have even conceived of trying to do on my own. And I mean, I think what those of us who play a lot of jazz like about it is that unpredictability, that there's something more that we can access in ourselves or from ourselves or kind of travels through ourselves because we're part of the group that we're a part of. So synergy is amazing and very unpredictable, unfortunately. And that if there were a reliable recipe to get it every single time, I think everybody would love that. I think what I talk about in the group is that we can't force synergy to happen. So synergy happening is much more like gardening than it is like, following a recipe or something, even though that can be unpredictable too. But like, you can't force plants to grow well. There's a lot of conditions. There's weather, there's soil, there's a whole bunch of, you might get aphids in your garden. There's a lot of things that are out of your control. So all you can do is try and create the best conditions you can for your garden to grow. And I think the same is true with trying to get a group in a position for synergy. So you can control the composition of the group. You can control whether we've got clear, vivid goals. You can control whether we have tasks that are motivating and diverse and aren't these like repetitive rote things that we have to do over and over. You can control whether we have clear norms for how we're going to communicate and how we're going to treat one another. And then you can try and create this environment of psychological safety. But from there, that's about the best you can do. And that I've been a part of the same group that one day will have amazing synergy and the next time we won't, right? That it really is sometimes that unpredictable. But that if we got that stuff right, if we got what I call the conditions for group effectiveness right, and we had well-composed groups with clear goals, good tasks, good norms, psychological safety, and then the availability of expert coaching, then that's basically the best we can do. And I think we'd be doing a lot better than we're doing right now.
Yeah. And a lot of the characteristics that you just described are things that we can do a lot for. And it is very similar to gardening. Like, you may not control the bulb, but like you can plant it and nourish it. And, you can't control the weather, but you can certainly water it. And I suppose you can pull in a light source if you need one. But understanding what are the characteristics that help groups flourish and achieve that synergy that is ephemeral and not predictable. I certainly had that experience in rowing. Like, some days it was amazing and you'd be like, well, let's just do that every time. And you can't. It just doesn't happen that way. But one of the things that I think is important, and you said this earlier, that we sometimes mistake is that, and I just want to ask you to maybe say a little bit more about this, but like the composition, because I think we maybe assume like if we get one person that's like this and one person that's like that and one person that has these qualities and one person that brings this personality, that we can manufacture like the ideal outcome for a group. And that's not quite right if I understood my reading of your book correctly. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like, what are we looking for with group composition?
So one of the most common mistakes I see with teams and organizations is how they're composed in the first place. So there's a great study of top management teams by one of my mentors, Ruth Wagaman, and some of her colleagues. And they asked all these top management teams, it was like 111 of them, a simple question. How many people are on your team? only 7% of top management teams agreed on how many people were on the team. So 93% of these top management teams gave different answers to some extent about how many people are there even on our team. So one of the most important things is that we know who we're working with in the first place. So when we're composing a team, first of all, we have to have some sense of boundary. Who is on this team and who is not on this team? Now, there's also the question of how many people should there be on the team? Now, I'm going to give an unusually precise answer for this question. So usually, when you ask a psychologist something, they'll give you a kind of a, it depends on this, that, or the other kind of answer. Teams are best when you have 4.5 people on them. Now, it's really hard to have 4.5 people for obvious reasons. But, and I'll tell you a little bit about where I got that number. So if we just care about how the team performs, you look at research on, the number of people on the team and team performance, you'll get answers anywhere from 3 to 7, depending on what kind of work people are doing. So somewhere between 3 and 7 people are best for task performance. But then if you ask people how satisfied they are being on the team and whether they think the team is too big or too small, you'll find that the lines between too big and too small cross at 4.5. So people are most satisfied being on teams between 4 and 5 members. And that's where, I think a lot of us can relate. If you're in a meeting with 10 people, the chances that everybody feels like they're heard, that they get to say what they want to say, that they get to share their expertise is really low. You'd have to sit there for a really long time with a group of 10 people for everybody really to give meaningful input. So the problem is, from a relationship perspective, that there's not a linear relationship between the number of people on the group and the number of relationships there are in that group. So like a group of 3 has to deal with 2 relationships, but a group of 6 has to deal with 24 relationships. And so our capacity mentally to keep track of all these different relationships really drops off right around 7. So we start to really struggle to keep track of who knows who gets along with who, what even is my relationship with everybody else on the team as the team gets larger. And that effect is really exponential. So we want to have these smaller groups when we're composing groups. And I would say that by far is the most common mistake, that when you talk to people who manage work teams and you say how many people on your team, it's usually more than 6. And it's usually substantially more than 4 or 5. So that's the kind of first order thing is, do we know who's on the team? And do we have a small enough group that we have a chance to know each other well enough to have psychological safety, to have synergy, to know each other's expertise and perspectives well enough? Now, the third thing is something that we talked about a bit already, which is this idea of, is there some trait that's actually helpful for teamwork? And that Anita Woolley, Chris Chabris, and some of their colleagues have done a lot of research in what they call collective intelligence. And they have measured every trait under the sun to try and figure out something that predicts being a good team member across tasks. And again, the science behind this is that it's really hard to find, and that most psychologists would say, well, intelligence is the most likely trait that would work, because that's what intelligence is it's supposed to predict your performance across a variety of different kinds of, especially cognitive tasks. But the average intelligence of a team or the maximum intelligence of a team member, these things are not very predictive of team performance. Instead, the one thing they found that could predict was what they call social sensitivity. And social sensitivity is basically your ability to intuit other people's emotions without them telling you. And that it's measured with actually a kind of fun test that you can do yourself. If you look up the mind in the eye, reading the mind in the eyes test, it's just you look at just somebody's eyes and then have to guess what they said their emotional state was from just looking at their eyes. And the average level of that trait on the team does predict the team's performance across a variety of tasks. So social sensitivity so far is the one measurable trait that we've been able to say the average level on the team is pretty helpful. But most importantly, and I'll save for last, is do we have the right skills for the task and that we have diverse skills and perspectives on the team? And so most people don't know the social sensitivity of other people in their organization. And I don't really think guessing is a great strategy. And whether an organization should measure everybody's social sensitivity or not, I'm a little ambivalent on. But if you're in charge of a team and you want it to have the best chance of synergy, you want to have a smallish team of between 3 and 7, ideally, 4, 5, 6 members. You want to look at the task and say, what skills do we need? And make sure that people have those skills on your team and that there's diversity of perspectives so that when we do have to make decisions, when we do have to come up with new ideas, we're not all going to say the same thing, that we're going to challenge each other. And that's what gives us the opportunity to have synergy, is the fact that we don't all know the same thing, the fact that we're not going to give the same answer or have the same ideas. So if we do those things, if we have a bounded team, if we have it relatively small, if we've got a thoughtful, diverse mix of skills and perspectives, then that's about the best composed team that you can have.
I wanted to finish with this question that you finish your book on, because I think if people are listening to this and saying, well, that's well and good, but I don't have that available to me. One of my favorite tips that you offer is the relaunch strategy. So I wonder if you can, to folks who are in a group that may be stuck in unhealthy patterns, describe what a successful group relaunch looks like.
So relaunches are one of my favorite strategies for trying to help a team. And I think everyone should relaunch it as often as they can. So I want to back up and just say launches are really powerful times in groups. So as we talked about, norms form really quickly. People's basic sense of what are we doing here? Why am I here in particular tend to form and stick in those first meetings. So launches are really crucial to get right in the first place, but they're also powerful tools if you have a group that feels like it's off course. And what a relaunch strategy involves is to really get buy-in from everyone that we're trying to make real changes here. And we're going to start over again like it's day one. And that means let's not meet in the same place we've been meeting. Let's not sit in the same places we've been sitting. If one person has been leading most of the meetings, maybe we want to shift that. Maybe there are some membership changes we need to make in the group and that this would be the time to make them. But the main things you're going to do are you're going to re-articulate the goal, say, here's why we're here. And also invite people to ask questions about that, to offer slight amendments to what it is we're here to accomplish. If you're the leader, to give your sense of what everybody is here to contribute and to give them the opportunity to say, here's what I think I can bring to this task. And to talk about the norms that we're going to follow in this group, especially for communication and sharing information, which tend to be where things go awry early on. And then to make sure that everybody has a sense of what they need to do coming out of this launch meeting and when we're going to reconvene for the next meeting and check again. And that if you do at least one of these relaunches, you've given yourself one of the best chance to change dysfunctional group dynamics, which is tough to do. But you're also giving yourself a chance to revise your goals, revise your norms, and to really target some of these aspects of group dynamics that tend to be sticky and hard to change. So I love relaunches as a strategy for groups, and I'm really glad you brought that up and asked me about it.
I love it too. And I'll just sort of pipe in and say, this is something that I love to do as a therapist, that inevitably you'll hit, some session number and feel like people are plateauing. And then it's either a time to relaunch and reestablish goals, or to say, maybe now it's time for you to go out on your own without the therapy setting as the place to kind of lean on, because now you have the skills. So in therapy, the objective is different because I'm always trying to work myself out of a job. But I love the idea of relaunching. I hadn't sort of used that verbiage for it, but resetting goals is 100% something that I think is very valuable in the therapeutic relationship and also in couples relationships where you kind of come back together and say, are we happy with how things are going? Or do we want to set new goals for ourselves, grow in new ways, revisit some of the habits that we've built? Because we sort of drift and we get lazy. So it's an opportunity, this kind of relaunch idea, to have a meeting of the minds and be more deliberate about establishing, like, how do we want to conduct this, duo relationship or group organization. So I think it's such a great tip, and I love the specific guidance that you just offered. So Colin, where can listeners find out more about you, your work? Where can they grab the book? Where can they find you?
So the best one-stop shop is my website, www.colinmfisher.com. So Colin, Colin, M, my middle initial, and Fisher, Fisher. And that will have links to my various social media endeavors, mostly LinkedIn right now. And I also have a Substack newsletter called The Collective Edge that you can subscribe to. And you can buy the book at your retailer of your choice.
Awesome. Well, we'll have all of that in our show notes. So everybody should go grab The Collective Edge, Unlocking the Secret Power of Groups. It's such a terrific read. And Colin, thank you so much for spending the time with me today. It was such an honor.
Oh, thank you so much, Yael. It was a real pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Hi, this is Yael. Welcome to the co-host post. I'm here with Jill to talk about The Collective Edge, Unlocking the Secret Power of Groups. This was a conversation that I loved having, and I actually met Colin. The backstory on this is that I met him through an academic writers group, and he is just interpersonally lovely. And this book was such a fun read and so fascinating for me as a relationship specialist. So, Jill, I am curious what came up for you as you were listening.
Well, first of all, we've been struggling to figure out what to call this debrief that we've started doing as co-hosts, and you just nailed it. The co-host host.
This is Michael's idea. Credit where credit is due.
Yeah. Well, you know what? That's actually a nice segue, because I have to say, like, while I was listening to this episode, which I loved, I mean, I just think group dynamics, it's fascinating to me. And of course, I was thinking a lot about us as a group, POTC as a group. And isn't that lovely that he came up with this cute idea? I thought it was you. You gave him credit. And, there were different things that he was talking about, like when he was talking about how people overestimate their contribution to the group. I was wishing that I had listened to this like earlier than this morning when we were recording today, because I thought, it would have been really fun to reach out to the team and ask, what percentage do you think you contribute? Because I guarantee it would be whatever 100 divided by 5 is. But then I had the thought, well, he said people also don't line up when they estimate how many members are on their team. So I thought, would we all say 5 or 6? I think we'd end up saying 6 because we'd include Jay.
I think so, yeah.
And then probably we'd say she contributes a little bit more than a 6th. And
I think we all know.
Contribute equally. And then you also talked about how, like, the best group number is 4.5. And I was like, well, you can't get much closer than that with our team. So it just, so many things were making me feel like really appreciative of our little group. And I feel like we have psychological safety and that it just works really well.
It does. So that's like so affirming. I hadn't thought about that, but everything you're saying is so true and maybe speaks to how we've been able to persist in there. It isn't that there haven't been rough patches. And like he talked about, I think this was such an important point. I was so glad that he made it about psychological safety, that we do disagree at times, and it isn't comfortable to disagree with people that you like and have to work closely with. But there is faith that we can bring things up and work them out. And the same thing is true in the couples therapy room, that it's not comfortable for many couples who are healthy and function well to disagree with one another. But the couples that are the strongest are the ones who bring it up and work it through even when it's uncomfortable. And that is a part of what makes a really strong unit, whether it's people or a larger group.
Yeah. And that when you have that psychological safety and that ability to have and resolve conflict, that's probably a big part of when you do get synergy. And I loved the way you used that crew metaphor for synergy. That was awesome. And it really reminded me of a conversation we have a lot on the podcast, which is the idea of holding outcomes lightly. That, we can control the choices we make and the steps we take, but whether you get synergy or not, like synergy really is an outcome. You can desire it and you can do things that make it more likely, but you really have to hold that outcome lightly. And I do wonder a lot about what are the just sort of non-specific factor, like when you go on a date or you meet a new friend, sometimes like you either click or you don't. Like there's something, well, what do you think as a relationship expert? Like there's something to be said for chemistry. And I'm just really curious about how do you even study that,
I think that's a really interesting question. And so this was actually something that I studied a little bit during my graduate school years, because I was really interested in this question of like, do birds of a feather flock together or do opposites attract? But it's pretty hard to study. And it's hard to study because yes and yes, like both are true.
Yeah.
And so it is hard to sort of come up with a recipe for it. But related to what you're saying, this isn't exactly the question that you're raising, but I was just thinking about synergy and how it might, this is an empirical question, but how it might sort of conceptually align with the idea of flow.
Yes, I had the same thought during the episode.
Yeah, it's like when you have that synergy experience, it's almost like time is irrelevant. Like time is both going fast and standing still, and you're just so in the zone. It feels so good. But I think like flow, it's not that it's super easy. And the rowing example that I gave totally aligns with that. When the boat is clicking, it's both hard and easy at the same time.
Well, it's like, it's hard to get there, but then you're there, it's just going.
You're just in flow.
But you got to keep doing the right things for the flow to continue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there might be, it would be interesting if anybody, and I don't know this to be the case, but has actually looked conceptually like if there is a correlation between the two constructs.
The other thing that I found myself thinking about was when you guys were having the conversation about social norms and, how social norms are sort of created almost instantaneously and how there's that like evolutionary adaptive. And he actually used the example of cults. And when you started talking about cults, it reminded me of a concept. It was a long time ago, but we had Dominic Packer on it was episode 234, The Power of Us, which was another episode about group dynamics, but very different content. So if people really liked this episode, that would be a great one to go back and visit or revisit. And he talked about optimal distinctiveness. And I always think of cults when I think about this, and it's that simultaneous need for humans to both have a sense of belonging, but to also feel like they stand out from others. And so whether it's a cult or whether it's being a hipster or whether, it's like we all want to feel like we belong to a certain community, but we don't want to see ourselves as conformists. We also want to think that we're distinct. And I found myself talking, like while I was listening to the episode, wishing that I could like jump into your conversation and ask him what he thought about that and how that kind of relates to social norms and evolution.
Yeah, I don't know what he would think, but that is such an interesting question. He definitely talks a lot about cults in his book. The thing that it sort of makes me think about too, just as another example of conformity, is the kibbutz experiment, which if people are familiar with it, was this project in Israel where they developed these communities that were socialist, Zionist in combination. And there was like a real pressure for conformity, and people sort of developed comfort with things that we would now find horrifying. My father at 4 days old was placed into a children's house and never lived with his parents because that was how they did it on the kibbutz. And it was very value aligned for them. Like they were really trying to equalize men and women and make it easier for children to get loving attention that wasn't so overly disciplined, and to create like equality for the betterment of everyone. But and so they kind of accepted it. But we look back on that now and we think, wow, that's like bordering on abusive. But
right.
them, it was so normal. It was just a part of the fabric of how they decided and designed a livelihood that felt loving and thoughtful.
Yeah, it was like executing the idea that it really takes a village.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I remember reading all about that in your book, Work, Parent, Thrive, and just being fascinated by that concept. These group dynamics are just, and you have to wonder, like, were there people who were questioning that, but then because of the sort of, group mentality, it did just become normal, which is what he was talking about when he was talking about these social norms developing and people being in cults and sort of putting their individual values aside and replacing those with the quote unquote values of the group.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to come back to your original question, it really is interesting, even just in an individual relationship, which is, of course, always where my mind goes. But like, if you're partnered with somebody, you both want to feel like you belong to them and that you're a unit and that you have similar values. And you want to have them look at you and say, wow, my partner is like unique and special in this way that is unique and special. So I think we do crave both. And it's hard to find that sweet spot. And so we can lean too much into conformity or into conflict. And when group dynamics are working in the healthiest way, I mean, you can think of it as the rowing example. It's like everybody's contributing something special and unique as they belong and create a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. And that is hard to arrive at.
Absolutely. And I think the importance of being thoughtful, like I am choosing these values and to be part of this group rather than just sort of falling in step.
Exactly. Well, thank you, Jill, for all of these awesome insights. I think Colin will be excited to hear your questions. And I hope people reach out to us with their thoughts on group dynamics because this is a fascinating topic. So thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. You can now listen to our podcast ad-free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. You can link to Patreon on our website or go to patreon.com/offtheclocksite.
If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review and sharing this episode with a friend or an enemy who would enjoy it.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our fabulous newsletter on Substack. Or if you're still addicted to social media, find us on Instagram and LinkedIn.
We'd like to thank our rockstar production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
Now for the boring part. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.